Hi, Ameer. I'm a non-developer who really loves to help developers. And today, I'm actually helping out a fellow developer, Heather, by filling in his spot. You can find me at ameer.hassan@APIMatic.io. So yeah, today I'm here to talk about developer experience. So of course, when you talk about developer experience, you're talking about your target audience, which is essentially the developers. And if you are able to speak their language or provide components that they need to easily consume your API, you're providing essentially a good developer experience. And ultimately, consequently, getting a good consumption of your API as well. Let us start by asking a question. How many developers do you think are there in the world? Yeah. 3? Yeah. 6. Yeah, I like the number. No, they're actually, according to Stack Overflow, they did a survey, there are 50 million developers across the globe, out of which 21 million are professional developers. And you can see the distribution across the globe, again, taken from the same data from Stack Overflow. The link is down at the bottom. And oh, by the way, we're right now sitting at probably one of the highest concentrations in the world of developers. So good place to be, I guess. So when we were looking at this data, it got us thinking that, hey, developer experience we know is fairly a recent phenomenon in the sense that we've recently started talking about it, and it got mainstream very recently. But developers are nobody new. They have been around for more than half a century now, right? So that actually got us thinking about the basic, in a sense, hey, how was developer experience handled back then? So let's say in the 50s and 60s. So let me quickly take you through an example. I don't know if there are many old school developers over here as well. So that's, of course, a machine code snippet. Would anybody be able to guess what exactly is that? Of course, no. Well, let's take a wild guess. Sorry. For what architecture? Well, that I don't even know, but yeah, here you go. All right, so yeah, it's a simple swap function, so just swapping the variables over there. And you have a high-level language code, and consequently, there's an assembly code, and then there's machine code. So that's how we ultimately evolved back in the day. Right now, developers code in high-level language, right? But it still gets compiled and processed into assembly and then to machine language. Why? Because our machines still speak in binary, right? But the thing is that everything else is done at the back while we look at the high-level language code. So that got us thinking, why is that, right? Why don't developers do machine language anymore, right? Because it's, of course, non-productive and unnecessary, because we've got systems in place who can take care of that, the non-productive or non-creative bit of that. So that was our aha moment for developer experience. So essentially, developer experience to us has always been about letting the developers focus on what's creative and abstracting out whatever's non-productive or redundant out of their lives. That's essentially making their life easy and getting a good experience. Fast forward to today's API world. So let's try to apply this analogy moving forward. So there's always a list for developer experience for API world. There's a list by somebody we really adore at APIMatic in Lane. Again, he lists down some components that are really essential for providing a good developer experience. Today, I'm only going to be talking about just 2 of them, SDKs and code samples. Why? Because it gets important when you get to these components. That's when the complexities start to kick in. By the way, feel free to tweet about it. Right. So it's these components where the complexities start to kick in. And you have to deal with challenges, different challenges. For example, this again is a distribution of same 50 million developers from Stack Overflow distributed into different communities based on languages, right? So it becomes important, and it becomes basically dependent upon the API providers. Which community would you drop if you don't have expertise in that language, or if you don't speak the language of that community? And again, it, I think, ties back to what the philosophy that Don was mentioning when he was talking about flying example. So you might end up missing out a community. For example, let's say that you decide that, hey, you're not going to have your documentation for Python guys. So take yellow guys out of this picture, because you've simply excluded that community. So in order to, moving on, in order to help API developers, let's have, again, a look back at a very basic concept of an API call. So an API call, of course, essentially is comprises of input, and of course, you get a response in the form of an output. And what sort of inputs that developer gets? So configuration, arguments, and authentication credentials. And after getting these inputs, a developer goes through a process, right? A series of steps. So checking and validation, encoding, serialization, building HTTP requests, making a call, deserialization, decoding, and handling errors, right? So developers are great. They're amazing problem solvers. So your developer would definitely go through these steps. But again, keeping in mind the same analogy of machine code versus high-level code, which of these steps are redundant? So it turns out all of these steps can be encapsulated in sort of in a box in the form of an SDK, and can be provided to your developer. And at APIMatic, we've been dealing with SDKs, auto-generated SDKs, for about 4 years now. And we think if you take care of an HTTP call and serialization and deserialization, your basic SDK is done. But why stop there in helping your developers? So how about you take care of the other redundant things like caching, retries, validation, authentication, linking, and so on. So for example, your API, your API takes OAuth 2.2-legged flow, right? So of course, developer can go figure out in generating tokens and keeping it refreshed every 30 minutes. But why not do that for him? Wouldn't that be a great experience in that sense? So this is what we believe, that automating all these redundancies can really alleviate your developer's experience. And at APIMatic, what we do is we do all of this, generate all of this from one single source of truth, your API spec. Moving on to the second item, code samples, your quickest way to first hello world. So they become really important as well. So initially, when we were dealing with SDKs at APIMatic, we relied on our customers to bring their own code samples and generate SDKs. So, and there are, of course, many tools out there that do some sort of generation of code samples for you, some sort of basic code samples. So let's look at an example. Here's one example of a code sample that's available out there. So when our teams looked into that sort of solutions available, there were two issues that we found out. A, most of those code samples were mostly static, which means that a static code sample is available, developer would have to add on the unique or the creative bits to it to make it work, A. And B, they were incomplete. So they were more of a code snippets that were not in, say, compilable forms. And of course, developers would have to figure out ways to add on code to make it complete. So recently, what we have been doing is the way we found a solution to this problem was what we call through dynamic code samples or reactive code samples. So what we do is we take that static bit of code sample and we allow the developers to basically inject those unique items, those variable items in those code samples to make them more complete. And we do that via an API console. I'm sure you guys would have seen many consoles that are out there. So I'll just quickly go through a few examples on what do I mean by that. So here you see on the right, there is a console where you could see the code is being populated. And on the left, you can actually see the parameters where the data is being put in. So an email address, for example, is being put in. And you can see that it's updated. I don't know if it's got a pointer. OK. So it's updated right in the code. And Aaron, you were just giving an example of that API, client ID and secret. So we do that too. We highlight it so that it becomes easier for developer to interact with that static code, and it really makes their life easy. So here, if let's say I click Add New, so there's create share payload. I entered my email address, or Adil's email address here. And if I click in, so you see that some further fields open up. There are text boxes where I can enter the data. And you see on the right, the code is also populated. But then there are some fields that require multiple choice, right? And usually, if you have good documentation, you would have sorted that out in your documentation. So of course, your developer could go back, look at what are those options, and fit that in the code. But what if you provide them as a multiple choice, right from your documentation over here? You see, if I click, let's say, enterprise over here, so a variable is created, company type dot enterprise. So then that all is happening in real time. So OK. So again, this is a code snippet, that the incomplete problem that I initially mentioned. It's again a code snippet, but it's done. So you can copy it and paste it in your application and get away with that. But what if you're writing your first hello world, and you're writing a code from scratch? So if I click show complete file, here you go. So a complete set of codes appears where you don't have to work around too much and get away with writing as minimum code as possible. So basically, again, the same idea of developer experience, the same philosophy of developer experience that try to keep the redundant bit automated, but then creative bit should be incorporated in there. So that's what we do with our code samples as well. You see, the static code is there, but then there are some items that are unique. So authentication, client ID, client secret is there, payload, body, these hello from APIMatic, you see. So these are the things that our developers can come in and just interact and generate their own customized, unique code samples. And again, all that is done through a single source of truth, your API specifications. All right. One thing you might have noticed is that here we talk about client ID and client secret, the only two things, right? So the authentication bit is done at the back. So to conclude, what developers should be doing? So of course, there are two sides to an API. on the API provider side, developers should be busy in exploiting the business proposition and the value proposition of your business and converting that into beautiful APIs. And on the consumer side, your developers should be busy in using those APIs in creating beautiful apps. But what they end up doing is on the provider side, they're creating, testing, updating documentation, portals every time the API changes or updated, code samples by hand, SDKs by hand, sometimes not by hand as well. On the other side, the consuming side of the developers, they're busy in HTTP logic, authentication, retries, and caching. Again, the redundant bit. So again, applying the same principles, we think that using, again, the same source of truth, single source of truth, your API specification, we can take that redundant bit and automate it for developers so that they can focus on the creative bit of development. I'd like to conclude by a quote that's really popular at APIMatic. We really love it, by Nelson Mandela. So if you speak to a developer in a language that he understands, that goes to his head. But, so not developer, a man, right? So, but if you speak to him in his native language, that goes to his heart. And developers are no different, right? So if you speak the language of your developers, you would make their life easy in consuming your API and would get a lot of love in return. Thank you.